to begin by thanking the Friends of the Beaufort Library. 14 years ago, when it became apparent that the Beaufort District collection was too small, it was your organization that gave me $25,000 of seed money to make the relocation to the second floor happen. And I am eternally grateful for that influx of money and support through all these years. That effort was led by one of your former presidents, Dina Colt. And I also want to make a shout out to Deb Chambers of the book room, because she still gives me first dibs on the good stuff, and I really appreciate it. So I thank you very much for inviting me to review this for you today. I haven't done this before, so bear in mind. So what you see here is the historical record of hurricanes in this area up until last year. There have been an awful lot of tropical systems passing within 60 nautical miles of Beaufort, South Carolina in the past 180 years. But today's book, Hurricane Jim Crow, discusses only one, the Great Sea Island Hurricane of 1893. As Dr. Rowland writes in his book, life was pretty good in Beaufort County during the 1880s and early 1890s. There hadn't been a major storm in 20 years, and the economy was cruising along quite nicely. But they had no way of predicting that Beaufort County would be struck by 5 hurricanes in the next 10 years, or that the first would be the worst. What's been written about the 5th most deadly storm to this day in the United States history? There was a considerable amount of national newspaper coverage about the Sea Island hurricane for a few months after it struck. But like today, very quickly other topics and events soon eclipsed it. Evidence of this is seen very easily in the contents of the BBC vertical files. We have a lot of clippings dated from late August 1893 to the summer of 1894 from a variety of national sources. Then there's a clipping here or there near an anniversary of the event. Then there's another flourish of articles about the unnamed hurricane after the hurricane of 1940. And a few survivors from 1893 were still around to be interviewed for after Hurricane Gracie in 1959. Members of the Beaufort County Historical Society researched 2 unpublished papers about the topic before 1960. I haven't found any particular reason why Rimmer Lane compiled these Savannah Morning News newspaper articles about the Sea Island hurricane in 1967, but we're the only library in the entire S.C. Lens consortiums to still have copies of this. More than 30 years would pass before anyone would write longer examinations of the 1893 hurricane. Authors have handled the event and the aftermath in different ways, by selecting, sharing, and interpreting facts, motivations of key players, and circumstances around the hurricane of 1893, based on the trends at the time, available materials, and of course, their own personal goals and interests. Beaufort County had a quiet 30 to 35 years of hurricane, when it came to hurricane, for a while. Hugo threatened in 1989, but it was Charleston that got hit the hardest. Anyone remember the traffic storms caused by that evacuation? And does anybody remember evacuating for Hurricane Floyd in 1999? Yeah, it was a mess. I think that's what inspired Bill and Fran Marsher, 2 of Beaufort's own, to write and self-publish books about the hurricanes. They were the first people to focus book-length attention on the subject of the Sea Island hurricane of 1893. Bill was then a retired engineer, and his wife, Fran, was a newspaper woman and former editor of the Island Packet. They both had a very deep interest in the area's environment and the risks inherent in living in the coastal plain. Both living in the danger zone, and the first edition of The Great Sea Island Storm of 1893 came out in 2001. They were both self-published. Their book about the Great Sea Island Storm got the interest of Mercer University Press and was revised and got a much better cover in 2004. 2006 saw two books come out, chiefly about the 1893 national disaster. Just briefly, though, Walter Frazier Jr., chair of the Georgia Southern University's History Department, made the Sea Island Hurricane his chapter 7, and Tom Rubelo lumped our tide of death and with all the 19th century hurricanes that caused damage in the Palmetto State in his hurricane destruction in South Carolina for the History Press. History Press specializes in short history titles that will appeal to the all-around history nerd. By this point, I had about a half a decade of experience working with customers who naturally seem to gravitate to scandals, death, and destruction. And now there were new tools at my disposal. Around this time, social media platforms became commonplace in library land. As I was searching for topics to write about, what I called red letter history days became great fodder. Thus, I began posting in the BDC's Connections blog about the Sea Island Hurricane around its 150th anniversary in 2008, soon to be followed by guides to BDC materials about our area's biggest natural disaster, thus far in terms of loss of life and environmental damage, to share with others on the WordPress blog. One day, in the early 2010s, someone called to ask if the BDC resources could confirm her family's oral tradition that a particular ancestor had died during the storm. In her case, the answer was no, but her ask did spur me to compile Storm of 1893 death list that's been up on the BDC's WordPress blog ever since. I started doing a local history program about the Sea Island Hurricane in 2013, mostly as an outward show of how the BDC contributed to the library's strategic plans. I'm still using parts of that presentation today for you, but some of the content has changed as more research has unfolded. For example, in 2015, Dr. Rowland's chapter about the Great Sea Island Hurricane of 1893 and its aftermath included information about the business interests of this area that I have since included in my time of death presentation. Also in 2015, I became very concerned about the excess handling of our Beaufort Hurricane of 1893 photograph collection. And with the fine help of the folks at the Low Country Digital Library, the collection is now hosted online, and you can see it. Similar concerns led to the digitization of the storm-swept coast of South Carolina that same year. The pamphlet is one of the key resources for personal accounts about what happened during the hurricane. We are one of the few libraries in the world to still have original copies of this rare and uniquely local booklet, compiled and published by Rachel Mather of the Mather School. I use it for my Tide of Death presentations, and when you read Dr. Grego's Hurricane Jim Crow, she uses it as well. Getting these guides and collections on the internet has led to an increased interest in the Sea Island hurricane and led to additional examinations of the natural disasters, including more than a few magazine articles by others. But the book-length versions include this one by Jay Barnes, who was then the CEO of the North Carolina Aquarium Society and sometime commentator for the Weather Channel, NBC Nightly News, and the Discovery Channel. He gives the Great Sea Island hurricane in this area 20 pages of this book that came out in 2022. He concentrated on the events and the need for coordination among local, state, nonprofit, faith-based, and national relief efforts in its response to natural disasters. The author today, her interest lies in the nexus, in her own words, in the nexus of the histories of labor, race and racism, and the environment. Thus, she has taken a different perspective on the event and its consequences than the authors I just mentioned. To my knowledge, she is the first person to write a book-length historical analysis of the disaster and its long-term consequences on politics, social structures, the economy, and the physical environment of the Lowcountry. And just like what happened when Dr. Rowland and Wise published Volume 3 of their magisterial History of Beaufort County, I'm going to have to adjust my next Tide of Death presentation to include additional information and interpretation from her book. Caroline grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, and writes about South Carolina's history. The earliest instance of her broadcasting her opinion in a public forum that I could find was a letter to the editor of the state newspaper protesting gender bias when she was in the 3rd grade. Thus, she is quite accustomed to arraying evidence and arguing her case. Educated at Middlebury College, the University of British Columbia, and the professor of the University of Colorado Boulder, she is currently an assistant professor of history at Queen's University of Charlotte in North Carolina. She takes a regional focus, particularly on the ramifications of the hurricane recovery efforts that goes beyond the borders of Beaufort County. She writes a lot about the political situation in Charleston and the politics of Governor Ben Tillman in this book. And I'm going to be upfront with you all and with myself. This book makes me uncomfortable. But, and there are several big buts, it is important to the research canon. It gives me the opportunity to review some of the holdings of the library's special collections units for you today. And as we get closer to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, it won't hurt any of us to consider reevaluating what we were taught in school about the origins and history of this country, and to consider other perspectives on that history. Arrangement of this book is shown on this slide. I am going to jump over the preface for a moment. I'm omitting the introduction and epilogue sections that discuss the life of Quash Stevens because he's not a Beaufortonian. He lives on Edisto. And I have a geographical imperative to concentrate on the history of Beaufort District. So, however, I do strongly encourage you to read or listen to the book about this fascinating Black man of Edisto Island, who also happened to be the son of a band of horse planter. The book begins with an overview of the history, economic, demographic, and environmental conditions of this area. Grego rightly stresses the danger of disease and discomfort inherent in our landscape and climate of this area before air conditioning, DDT, and modern weather diagnostics. She accurately writes about the fear felt by white people regarding all the African Americans in their midst through time. And this is just to alert you. She is a 21st century historian, so the term that she uses the term, quote, labor camp, rather than plantations to describe the land upon which enslaved people worked and survived. The bare bones of the history of this story is captured in this historical marker put up at Penn Center in 2008 by Penn and the Beaufort County Historical Society. The worst devastation happened here because Beaufort County was in the northeast quadrant of that hurricane when it at landfall. There was a 12-foot tide and 120-mile-per-hour wind. 2,000 or more people died, while 70,000 people were left destitute across the coastal plain. Bill and Fran Marshers, the Great Sea Island storm, put it quite simply, quote, "The hurricane hit the state's coast in the worst possible place, the flat, remote sea islands, and it hit at the worst possible time, near the end of harvest season, on high tide. Its violence was most ruthless against the nation's most vulnerable citizens, the Gullah." Dr. Grego states in her preface that she first visited the BBC research room in 2016. So I'm not breaking any professional code of ethics by saying so now. She acknowledges that it was that visit that got her to thinking about the hurricane of 1893 and how that event had a profound and lasting effect on African Americans in particular. This is the list of people that we know, who we know died. I'll read you a little bit of an excerpt. The list of the dead is piecemeal and relentless. Extended families, married couples, children bearing only the last names of their mother or father. No name, only unknown body. 282 entries line the pages of the forever partial list of the dead, collected over 2 days by a group of hastily deputized, exhausted assistants to Beaufort County coroner after the Great Sea Island storm rolled through the Low Country on the night of August 27, 28, 1893. All but a couple dozen of the thousands of dead were African American. The list is valuable not simply as a record of the dead, but as a tangible artifact of people who once lived. For some of these Sea Islanders, this list represents one of very few times, if not the only, that their name appeared in a record that yet still exists. Like the many entries of unnamed child on the list, those others who were cataloged as unnamed were not nameless when they lived. Their inclusion is a poignant reminder of the limits of our knowledge and the extant historical record. This list is part of the Hurricanes Archive at Beaufort County Library. This archive coalesced around the hurricane, revealing the workings of politics, labor, daily lives, human relationships, and the Low Country environment in ways that we might not have had the opportunity to understand without it. She rightly points out that the documentary evidence is limited to a few African American voices, unmediated by white folks. I do, however, take some comfort that in spite of this list limitation, she did write. The Beaufort County Library's Hurricane Archive has immense possibilities for researchers, and I am gratified that she indeed used components from our collections in her book. We have surviving Beaufort County Coroner Inquisition records on microfilm. She doesn't mention any of the testimony given in these records in her book, probably because she didn't or chose not to go through the microfilm of these at the time. I understand that. I've only transcribed a few too, for myself and for my own purposes for the BDC. The inquests themselves are difficult to read for two reasons. The script, as you can see, is light in certain places. It's a crabbed hand. It's sometimes hard to decipher what the letters mean. And the sheer depth of the human tragedy portrayed in here is hard to absorb. But I want to give you a sense of what's in these records by sharing one with you. H.J. Middleton wrote, I live in Land's End, Beaufort County. On the night of August 27, 1893, we were visited by a cyclone and tidal wave. Deceased are my wife and children. The wind blew a gale. We were all right at that time, but as soon as I saw the water get near the house, we made for a tree with the children. But the waves were so great and the tide was so strong that we could not help ourselves. I had 2 of the children under my arms. I found the water getting too deep and worse. I was compelled to turn them loose. I found the children and all on the next evening. If I had not turned them loose, I would have drowned myself. And that still, after all these years, breaks my heart. While I agree with Dr. Grego's overall description of the event itself, I want to point out a few factual errors relating to Beaufort folks. When she was doing research in 2016, in our room, I hadn't yet seen Mr. Talbert's direction to the News and Courier account that his wife had died of fright at the height of the storm. He wrote a correction to the newspaper to say that she had been ailing for some time after having given birth, and that she died about 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon from that complications from childbirth. We also didn't have the Crofut diaries at that time. When Mrs. Ellen Crofut notes that Mrs. Talbert's death occurred before the main force of the hurricane hit. There isn't a surviving inquest record for her because she died of natural causes. And of course, childbirth, death from childbirth complications was not unknown of in the late 19th century. The archives of the Charleston News and Courier have since become available in digital form through the State Library. And Ellen Crofut's diaries were donated to us by Molly Gray in 2018. In other words, Caroline didn't have access to this information, or I did at the time she was doing the research for his book. That's sort of the way things work with research. New materials may arise that mean older materials may need some updating. Another area of fact related to people in Beaufort. This photo was taken about 1900. Susan Hazel Rice, does this have a pointer? Is the older lady here close to me. Her niece, spinster Fanny Hazel, is in the front to her right. Susan Hazel Rice was born in 1830, making her 63 years old at the time of the 1893 hurricane. While she was indeed Dr. Gowan Hazel's little sister, she was no teenager, nor a young woman when she reported her sorrow about his death in her diary in our collection. I think what likely happened is that that Caroline got Mabel Byrne and Susan Rice mixed up in her notes. Mabel Byrne, a vintage woman at that time, wrote about her memories of the storm when she was a teenager. So that's understandable. Christensen descendants who read this book will bristle, perhaps, and be surprised by the description of their ancestor, Captain Niels Christian, as a Dutchman. He was born in Denmark. Oh. Another criticism. I think that Dr. Grego's conclusion about Small's parentage is perhaps too firm for the circumstances. I refer you all to Yearning to Breathe Free. Dr. Billingsley, a sociologist, researched the 4 most likely candidates, and for his conclusion, you can borrow the book from the local history sections at the library. This section contains Dr. Grego's biggest contribution to the literature. She describes how three distinct constituencies, Black Sea Islanders, white landowners, and the Red Cross, grappled with the hurricane's destruction and competing interests regarding who and what should be the driving forces in the state going forward after the storm. Black Sea Islanders worked towards maintaining independence and autonomy based on owning their own farms. White landowners and other parts of the state in particular wanted access to cheap, subservient labor and more land. And Clara Barton's Red Cross was stuck in the middle, struggling to do good work among the hurricane survivors in an increasingly racially charged political environment. Local folks knew that the scope of the hurricane was well beyond their ability to cope, but they did so for almost 30 days. The county's prominent men organized themselves to take action. 5 were white men, 2 were black men. Robert Smalls and his son, a different member of his family, George W. Ford, were black men. Rachel Mather called these people, this committee, in her book, Storm Swept Coast, wise and kind men who were and ever on the alert to encourage the desperate people thronging into Beaufort in search of food and shelter. George Holmes was the mayor of Beaufort. He was a white man. Robert Smalls, hero of the planter, was a longtime fellow politician and the so-called king of Beaufort. He was also the port's customs collector at this time. Mr. Lockwood was the head of the Beaufort Bank. Mr. Christensen, we just talked about, Captain Christensen. He was an immigrant Dane who joined the Union Army but stayed in Beaufort after the war. He was a prominent Bay Street merchant, mill owner, and landowner. Mr. Walsh was a Bay Street merchant. George Ford was superintendent of the Beaufort National Cemetery at the time. He was one of the local men who did their very best in trying circumstances to improve conditions of his neighbors, both black and white. According to his obituary on file in the research room, there was an immense turnout of all classes at his funeral. Fully 500 colored people attended the ceremonies and paid a last tribute to the departed at the Baptist Church of Beaufort. If you visit the BDC's table in the lobby, you will, I think we brought a few of the documents relating to him with us. And if we didn't, it's my fault, not my staff's fault. Some people consider white businessman J.J. Dale another victim of the hurricane. An opinion about his character and motives vary. His Beaufort Gazette Palmetto Post obituary states, he was a liberal contribution to all charitable objects and was a conspicuous figure whenever push and perseverance met. But on page 187, Dr. Grego describes this man as, quote, a cotton factor of dubious reputation among the African Americans, but of solid standing among the whites on account of his actions during the Combahee rice strikes. According to Dr. Grego, fear that the reconstruction would return if there was fear among the white community that reconstruction would return if the government-sanctioned aid came into the region. It hadn't been all that long since Reconstruction had ended in South Carolina. That caused the response effort to take on all sorts of politicized dimensions. This man is probably my least favorite South Carolina person ever. As Grego writes, Governor Tillman hated the fact that Black people had some political pull in the coastal areas of the Palmetto State. Quote, the white leadership in Charleston despised Tillman for his vulgarity, his frequent taunts of the white low country elite, and his mimed populism. And of course, because Tillman saw himself as the champion of white supremacy in South Carolina. Black residents felt no allegiance or trust towards him. But even he couldn't deny that things were so bad in Beaufort County that he sent down Dr. James Babcock to verify what the Beaufort Relief Committee was saying. The Relief Committee, upon which canny and pragmatic Robert Small sat, was Governor Tillman's nightmare come to life. In Grego's words, it was an integrated coalition of locally mobilized, sufficiently well-to-do businessmen and politicians. Black Beaufortonians did not yet see any reason to bow to political pressure from Columbia or Charleston. But soon they were overwhelmed. And though they fought back in some ways by not following all the instructions sent to them, once Tillman put the Beaufort Committee under the supervision of his more to his liking Charleston Relief Committee. And then the Charleston Relief Committee became the General Relief Committee, and that was packed with ex-Confederates. Nevertheless, after the hurricane, South Carolinians fought over every aspect of the recovery effort. The Red Cross was in an almost impossible position. This was the organization's very first hurricane relief effort, and South Carolina politics of the day were brutal. She tried to keep the organization's response in the middle, but the, quote, white elite hoped to use the hurricane to challenge Black autonomy in the Low Country, quote, by amplifying white disgruntlements, particularly in Bluffton and Pocatello. Now, in fairness to Clara, where was I? Sorry, that's my phone, it'll go right. She tried to keep the organization's response in the middle, but the white elite hoped to use the hurricane to challenge Black autonomy in the Low Country by amplifying white disgruntlements, particularly in Bluffton and Pocatello. In fairness to Clara, the Red Cross mission, as given by Governor Tillman, was to ignore the mainland areas. She did so, and Tillman took his plan to regain control over the Low Country forward. His goal, according to Dr. Grego, was to thwart Black autonomy by hook or by crook. By the time of Governor Tillman's annual address in late November, the Red Cross had been working about 7 weeks and was already making a difference, in spite of the circumstances. In his address to the State Address in November of that year, he called the Sea Island hurricane the most disastrous storm and tidal wave to date. He mentioned over 1,000 people dead and a total loss of crops, all the way from Johns Island to Hilton Head. He reckoned that half of the houses were also blown down or washed away. He credited charity of individuals and the Red Cross for saving some people from starvation. But he was talking out of both sides of his mouth and actively weaponizing economic and social trouble for his own ends. I'm going to have to adjust my tide of death presentation if anybody's seen it before to incorporate Dr. Grego's discussions and explanation about those circumstances. This chapter is hard reading. It's based on Grego's 2019 article for the Journal of Southern History entitled Black Autonomy, Red Cross Recovery, and White Backlash after the Great Sea Island Storm of 1893. And you can read that in our Hurricane of 1893 vertical file if you want to make an appointment to come to our collection. She describes determined actions taken by residents in Bluffton and Pocatello to spread misinformation about Red Cross recovery efforts to bolster their relentless plans to remove political gains for Black people that Black people made during Reconstruction. She lays out her evidence for her conclusions concretely to set up part 3. When Black Sea Islanders viewed as personal and familial tragedy, the Tillmanites viewed as a political and social opportunity. Grego argues that the hurricane unleashed a rabid dog of racism that ultimately led to Jim Crow era and an exodus of African Americans from the state that lasted for the next 75 years. It began with the dismantling of the state's Reconstruction era Constitution. This is a rhetorical question for you to consider. What do you think the Tillmanites found most offensive with this list? Pretty much all of it, yeah, I heard all of it. White supremacists, supporters of Ben Tillman and John Gary Evans, his successor as governor in 1895, used all the tools we see being used by political operatives today. Media saturation of propaganda and tropes, making persons not of your own political persuasion a threatening other through time. She argues that the hurricane of 1893 afforded those people an opportunity to advance their agenda to remove Black men's voting rights. There was growing support among certain sections of the white community to force Blacks to leave the state or either return to economic subjugation to white landowners and Black men. Key names in what I call the exodus strategy were the men listed here: Harry Hammond, who was a descendant of Governor James Henry Hammond. He's an interesting guy. You should read about the Governor Hammond. But he was serving, Theodore Jervey was a Charleston area judge. And Ambrose, the Gonzalez brothers were actually sons of an Elliott woman from Beaufort. They ran the state newspaper. African Americans of the Low Country were not naive, nor did they just roll over. Beaufort County's delegation to the 1895 Constitutional Convention were all Black men. They, along with R.B. Anderson, a Black Republican delegate from Georgetown County, fought the good fight to retain suffrage for adult Black males. Perhaps you've seen this bust at Tabernacle Church. In a convention packed with ex-Confederates, he boldly stated, "I stand here, the equal of any man. I started out the war with the Confederates. They threatened to punish me, and I left them. I went to the Union Army. I fought in 17 battles to make glorious and perpetuate the flag that some of you have trampled under your feet." When the vote was taken, the tally was 116 to only 7 opposed. The Beaufort delegation asked to be excused before the vote and refused to sign the adopted document. For all the ins and outs of all the political maneuvering at which Robert Smalls was a master, I recommend this book, Gullah Statesman. It's available in print from the local history sections of the branch libraries, as well as an ebook via the library's Hoopla service. If you can't borrow a print copy of Hurricane Jim Crow from the library, you can borrow an ebook or audiobook, or both, from the library's Hoopla service. Just ask for assistance if needed. Oh, sorry. And I want to point out that the audiobook says our town's name wrong. We are Beaufort, South Carolina, in this book. That was bad. One of my favorite books of all time is actually this one. It points out that we native South Carolinians have our own lingo that other folks from other places think is wrong. But you're wrong. As the NIFAs point out, does that look like NIFA to you? It's NIFA. Native South Carolinians are very proud of tradition. According to Gerhard Spieler's newspaper articles, while both Beaufort, North Carolina, and Beaufort, South Carolina, are derived from the same French word for beautiful, the inhabitants of North Carolina, and most people who use this name, chose the modern French pronunciation for the first syllable, Beau, while the South Carolinians, town residents, retained the medieval French way of saying Beau. So we are Beaufort, and it's older than what they do. So age sometimes trumps my currency. And as a 10th generation South Carolinian myself, I can tell you, of course, we would choose the older, more traditional pronunciation. Hurricane Jim Crow by Carolyn Grego is an important contribution to the literature about the hurricane, about the state's history, about race relations in South Carolina, about Palmetto's state economic and social life. She makes a lucid, clear-eyed argument that the aftermath of Beaufort's district's most significant natural disaster to date allows white supremacists to institute their racial and political agenda. Her scholarship is solid. Her word choices are strong. At times, her writing is even lyrical. She's writing with the fresh perspective of an intellectual historian of the 21st century. So some of her conclusions might be uncomfortable for some readers. But we humans grow when we embrace the uncomfortable. I give this book 4 stars, and I hope you will borrow it and read it. Thank you.